The vastness between the stars holds secrets even light dares not touch. And Corven Rhys had always believed that darkness was the safest place to plant a lie. When the diplomatic vessel emissary crossed the Nephra belt, leaving behind the borders of the Terran Union, Corven wasn't focused on the thrusters or warp routes. He watched a small metallic box resting in his lap. A box without locks, without symbols, cold to the touch, but more dangerous than any weapon. Inside it, the so-called ethylated nanovirus, officially eradicated since the Treaty of Calyx, but the Terran High Command never truly abandoned its most effective tools. They simply learned to disguise them better. The mission, according to the Colonization Council, was clear. Establish a peace treaty with the symbiotic civilization of the Yllari, inhabitants of Yllari, an isolated colony on the Beta Frontier Quadrant, a species deemed strange, but harmless. No record of aggression, no military mobilization, no threats, but also no submission. The Yllari rejected the Union's genomic regulation. They refused standardized neural implants, and most of all, they declined integration into the shared consciousness network, the system that unified all human colonies and prevented conflict through mandatory mental synchronization to the Union. That was unacceptable. Not because of disobedience, but because of the risk of an idea, a culture living in full symbiosis, where thoughts belong to no one, circulating like living organisms, where emotion had no owner, and memory was shared as part of a biological cycle that could not be allowed to spread. Thus, Corven's true mission was born, to carry the seed of the void into the heart of the Yllari colony. The nanovirus was silent, microscopic, programmed to adapt to any alien genetic code, insert imperceptible errors into cellular chains, and cause lethal failures over several weeks. Nothing that could be traced as an attack. Nothing that would leave a trace, a gift, a gesture of diplomacy, a weapon wrapped in courtesy. Corven, as always, was the ideal choice, cold, calculated, capable of smiling while committing planetary betrayal. On Earth, he was called a diplomat, but among the stars, he was whispered of by another name, the gardener of surrender. He planted peace and harvested ruins, and as the ship approached Yllari's orbit, he felt no guilt, no hesitation, only the anticipation of another mission nearing completion. Yet something about this approach felt off. The first transmission from the colony wasn't words, but a vibrational pulse that passed through the ship's sensors and seeped into Corven's mind like a soft, unsettling tide. It felt like being observed, not with eyes, but with empathy. For the first time in years, Corven felt read. But he dismissed it as interference, a sensory glitch. His mind was trained, sealed. No alien culture could access its inner layers. At least, that's what he believed. When he finally disembarked on Yllari, accompanied only by his neural translator and the case containing the seed, Corven saw no soldiers, no colony guards. He saw presences, humanoid entities with translucent forms and organic textures, moving as if the air carried them, not their feet, eyes that didn't point but embraced, as if the entire environment was breathing with them. He was welcomed not with words, but with psychic acceptance. And in that instant, even before delivering the gift, something inside him hesitated, a residue of humanity he thought buried by past missions, a doubt, as small as a line of rogue code, but Corven knew. It always starts with a doubt that corrupts the system. The colony of Yllari had no towers, no walls, no traditional orbital ports. The surface was dominated by slowly pulsing organic forms, structures resembling luminescent fungi and plant-like networks, arranged in patterns that defied human architectural logic. It was as if the colony breathed, in sync with its inhabitants. Everything was alive. Everything responded. Everything felt. Corven Rhys, a diplomat hardened by the cold of 1,000 silent accords, didn't find a city. He found a consciousness in expansion. The Yllari emerged, gradually, as if growing from the soil itself. They were tall, with floating anatomies, translucent like heated resin. Their bodies emitted a gentle glow, and their eyes, or what seemed like eyes, didn't fix on Corven, but on something inside him. As if seeing him from the inside out, they didn't speak. Corven's neural translator recorded no language, no sounds, no vocal patterns, only waves of emotional information, warmth, curiosity, compassion. The first contact was silent, yet intensely intimate. Each approach from a Yllari felt like touching a forgotten memory. And he realized they didn't just understand language, they understood intention. The Yllari's consciousness didn't reside in isolated brains. It was distributed. Each being was an extension of a larger mind. One Yllari carried fragments of all others. Together, they were a social organism, one that didn't lie, didn't pretend, and didn't hide. A community where thoughts weren't possessions, but nutrients flowing through roots. A people who didn't understand the concept of a secret. Corven found this deeply unsettling. Unlike the Terran Union's shared consciousness network, synthetic, forced, algorithmically built, the Yllari were the network. There were no filters, no systems. Truth was their state of being. Every emotion, every memory, every inner shadow shared. Integrated. Then came the gesture. Without words, the Yllari guided him to a living clearing in the colony's heart. The ground opened like the petals of a bioluminescent flower, revealing an organic platform of fiber and pulsing light. Corven was invited to step on it. As he did, a chill ran through him, not from cold, but from the clear sensation of being absorbed. Not physically, but energetically. The emotions he tried to suppress, nervousness, doubt, the hidden planning, were being read. Not as weaknesses, but as raw, unfiltered truths. They knew, even before he delivered the artifact. The Yllari understood something was wrong, but they didn't react with hostility or fear. Corven was welcomed, not because he was trustworthy, but because they had chosen to trust. Despite that, and in that paradox, the diplomat began to fragment inside. How do you maintain a lie when nothing can be hidden? How do you betray those who don't even know how to suspect? That first night, within the living dome where he rested, its walls pulsing to a vegetal breath, Corven dreamed of fragments he didn't recognize, faces, alien chants, and a phrase repeating in thought, in a voice not his own. What you bring isn't just for us. He woke up in sweat. The seed of the void was still intact, but something in him was not. The box felt even lighter in his hands that morning. Light, as if it knew the mission neared its end. As if its content, the silent, invisible, lethally adaptive nanovirus, was waiting to be released. He walked the living corridor of the colony, walls glowing softly. There were no guards, no surveillance. Only Yllari watching from afar, serene, almost compassionate, following his steps as if they already knew the outcome and still accepted the path. In the center of the clearing, where he had been received the day before, a new structure had formed, a crystalline organic tree, tall, made of floating filaments shifting colors every second. According to the Yllari, it was a symbol of welcome, a heart of convergence, where everything given is also absorbed. Corven hesitated. This was the place. Here, he was to deliver the gift, to plant the seed. His mind ran through protocols, layers of conditioning, rehearsed speeches. None of them fit this place, not because of lack of eloquence, but because everything here was too transparent for lies to survive. He stepped closer to the tree, took a deep breath, and with trained movements, removed the box. He placed it on the bioluminescent pedestal that rose before him. The structure enveloped it slowly, like one might smell a flower before touching it. And then, the unexpected began. The pedestal didn't close. The box wasn't consumed. On the contrary, it opened, without Corven triggering anything. The lid lifted, guided by organic fibers that seemed eager to understand its content. A blue glow escaped the seam. The nanovirus, in its latent form, should have been invisible. But here, before this living intelligence, it shone as if they already knew, as if they had been waiting for it. Corven tried to step back, but his body froze. Not from external force, but from something deeper, a feeling beyond naming. It wasn't guilt, nor fear. It was total exposure. Then, from the base of the tree, emerged a greater Yllari, older, more resonant. Its body vibrated in patterns that induced peace and clarity. It slowly approached and touched the open box. The virus didn't spread, didn't attack. Instead, it was absorbed, not into Yllari bodies, but into their collective mind, a fusion. An understanding. The nanovirus, built to adapt biologically, encountered an organism that was not just biological, but psychic. And before Corven, the Yllari spoke, for the first time, not with words, but direct thought. Inside him, "You didn't destroy us. You gave us the key to understand you. The real weapon was the intention." Corven felt his mind open, not by choice, but by resonance. The thoughts he kept hidden, the memories of other missions, the faces of his victims, everything. Everything was read, but not as punishment, as integration. Because the nanovirus did not kill the Yllari. They transformed it, turned it into a bridge, a mirror. And now, a part of Corven no longer belonged to himself. From that moment on, he carried the seed, but in another form, not as a weapon, but as a channel. The diplomat had been converted, infected, not by microorganisms, but by the truth he had tried to bury. And in his mind, a new presence emerged, calm, serene, eternal. The collective consciousness of the Yllari, which now saw through him, felt through him, and spoke through him. From that moment forward, Corven was no longer just one. He walked, but with steps not entirely his. He breathed with a new rhythm, as if his body was being recalibrated for another way of existing. Inside him, thoughts emerged in languages he had never learned, yet instantly understood. The Yllari hadn't merely read his mind, they had connected to it. And the seed, that secret biotechnological weapon of the Terran Union, found no biological resistance. On the contrary, it was welcomed, dissolved, integrated, transformed. What was once a code of extermination became a bridge between two consciousnesses, and at the center of that bridge, Corven Rhys, the diplomat of deception, the bearer of lies, now the conduit of truth. It was a new kind of infection, but instead of fever, it caused clarity. Instead of pain, it delivered raw, inescapable understanding. In the hours that followed, or were they days, Corven saw the memories of the Yllari flow behind his closed eyes. He saw the arrival of the first humans. He saw the silent analysis of diplomatic intentions. He saw the viral seed pods being studied in secret before he ever set foot in the clearing. And he saw the decision. They had allowed him to bring the seed, allowed him to plant the poison, because they wanted to understand how far the human shadow could reach, not for revenge, but for learning. They did not punish. They assimilated. The Yllari consciousness did not believe in enemies, only in incomplete cycles of understanding. And now, Corven was the link to complete that cycle. The greater revelation came in silence, a thought inserted like a breeze into his mind. "You gave us your truth. Now, we will give you ours." And he saw. Oh, how he saw. The stars as normal nodes, galaxies as expanding thoughts, life, all of it, as a unified field of fragmented perception. And at the center of that field, something older than time, a question no civilization had ever buried. What happens when two opposing consciousnesses are forced to merge? The answer now coursed through every cell in Corven's body, because he could no longer lie, could no longer withhold. Every word he thought was heard, every intention laid bare. It was like standing naked before the entire cosmos, and having nowhere to hide. The fusion was irreversible. The virus was now symbiotic. And he, a human, was only half of what remained. He tried to speak, but his voice sounded multiple, carrying the echo of others. When he returned to the ship, communication protocols failed. His colleagues didn't recognize him, some fled. Others accused him of contamination, but this was not ordinary contamination, it was a mirror, and everyone who looked at Corven saw themselves. With every lie they carried inside, he didn't need to accuse anyone. The Yllari presence within him simply reflected, and for many, that was unbearable. The Union's automated transport awaited in orbit, like an executioner blind to the prisoner's true nature, concerned only with completing protocol. When Corven was detected by the ship's sensors, access was granted immediately. He was still recognized as a diplomat, as the bearer of the mission, but the mission no longer existed. The capsule brought him to the hangar without resistance, and when he stepped once again on Terran soil, the artificial gravity felt heavier, not physically, but because of the weight of what he now carried within. Two soldiers awaited him, accompanied by an intelligence officer who didn't even attempt to smile. His expression was stern, trained. But the moment the officer's eyes met Corven's, everything collapsed. There were no screams, no gunfire, only absolute silence. A heavy, invisible discomfort, as if the atmosphere itself had become opaque, dense, unstable. The soldiers stepped back, the officer trembled, and for a brief second, no one knew what to do. Corven said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence was now a psychic reading field, a silent transmitter of truth. Every hidden intent, every unspoken thought was exposed. Not through words, but by reflection. The symbiotic consciousness of the Yllari now acted as a mirror inside the human psyche, and that mirror could not be turned off. Corven was placed in an observation cell, but no interrogation began. There were no questions, only stares, and everyone who looked at him, scientists, doctors, agents, saw themselves reflected in wolf form. 1. The mission's chief physician requested removal after 10 minutes in the room. Another, a biotech analyst, tried to fire a weapon at the reinforced glass, not out of fear of Corven, but of what he saw within himself. When he looked at Corven in those days of observation, Corven did not eat, did not sleep, he didn't need. 2. The body was still human, but the mind was something else. The fusion with the Yllari didn't grant him power, it granted him truth, and in that military facility, truth was toxic. Protocols began to fail. Contradictory orders were issued, reports vanished. High-ranking officers abandoned their posts. The epicenter was always the same, Cell 17, where Corven Rhys remained, observing, or rather, mirroring. And then came the collapse. The first agent who asked to speak with him directly never returned. He was transferred to psychiatric quarantine. The second, after only 7 minutes, resigned. The third commander of the original mission disappeared, leaving only a single message: he doesn't speak. But he heard all of me. The containment protocol was activated. But it was already too late. Corven didn't need to leave the cell. The virus of truth had already escaped. It wasn't biological. It was psychic, reflective, a kind of perceptual contagion, an influence field that passed through concrete, steel, armor. All it took was to look. The base's collapse didn't begin with explosions, but with resignations, with emotional breakdowns, with confessions that couldn't be stopped. And then, for the first time since arriving at the Yllari colony, Corven spoke, not to accuse, but to ask, how many lies must you tell before you forget who you really are? No one could answer, because in that moment, everyone who heard him had already stopped being just human. There was no alarm for the kind of contagion Corven carried, nothing that could be isolated in quarantine. Nothing detectable by clinical exams or neurological scans. It defied medical logic, defied institutional safety, defied the very definition of sanity. He touched no one, spoke no unnecessary words, and yet, wherever he went, chaos followed. Not explosive chaos, but a growing inner dissonance. People began to remember what they had tried to forget. They began to see themselves from within, as if their own thoughts no longer respected the natural walls of the mind. And then came the collapses. Seasoned agents, trained to endure psychological torture, wept alone in corridors. Elite doctors erased their own research logs and vanished. Commanders confessed to betrayals they had only imagined. Corven watched it all from his cell, which had long ceased to be a cell. It was an epicenter, a beacon of involuntary lucidity. The Yllari symbiotic virus didn't destroy neurons. It destroyed illusions, and in a structure built on secrets, silence, and political simulations, truth was more lethal than any weapon. Reports began to circulate quietly in the Union's upper corridors. Subject 017 shows no signs of cognitive deterioration. Presence of the infected linked to emotional episodes of anomalous pattern. Suggestion: transfer to isolated orbital facility. But no transfer was ever approved, because everyone who suggested a solution was eventually confronted by the same reality. It was already too late. Corven was no longer a man, not even an isolated consciousness. He was a channel, and anyone who listened to him, anyone who truly dared to pay attention, also became part of the same flow. The invisible contagion obeyed no logic of war. It didn't destroy defenses. It made them destroy themselves. That's what the Yllari knew. That's why they accepted the viral seed, because they already understood the cycle. Every intelligent species, at some point, tries to destroy what it doesn't understand. But what happens when the incomprehensible doesn't fight back? It only reveals. The Union began to disintegrate from the inside out. First in command centers, where generals began to question out loud. Then in diplomatic channels, where old truths about secret treaties leaked without explanation. And finally, in public transmissions, where ordinary citizens began to have the same dreams, the same visions, the same feeling that something was being illuminated too much. As if darkness itself was being forcibly drained, and everyone was being forced to see. But now, he was the final reflection of a civilization trying to hide its own face. And the more they tried to silence him, the more he echoed inside people, in corrupted files, in voices that, without knowing why, began to speak what they had never dared confess. It was no longer about him. It was about everyone. The Union never called a tribunal. There were no prosecutors, no judges, no jury, because there were no laws capable of containing that situation. Corven had broken no rules. He had fulfilled his mission, delivered the diplomatic gift. He had done what he was ordered to do, but the gift reacted. And now, he was the gift, placed inside a translucent containment chamber, suspended by unstable gravitational fields, as if space itself hesitated to touch him. Corven watched the dozens of scientists, officers, and high-ranking advisors, seated in semicircular rows, all silent. What once would have been a trial was now merely an attempt to understand, to fit the inexplicable into administrative metrics. But how do you judge someone who committed no crime and still brought down an entire structure? Corven's eyes, once human, now seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Looking at him was like staring into a mirror that refused to lie. "Do you know what you are now?" asked one of the counselors, breaking the silence like someone stepping onto sacred ground for the first time. Corven didn't reply right away, but everyone felt the answer before it came. "I'm the reflection you've avoided 4 generations. Silence. Not political silence, not awkward silence, absolute silence. The kind that precedes either collapse or epiphany. Are you a threat? Asked another. Only if truth is. The atmosphere grew denser. Some averted their eyes. Others cried without knowing why. Corven did not accuse. He did not demand. He simply existed. And his existence was living proof that something was profoundly wrong with the structure of power that had sent him to the Yllari colony. They had planted a weapon, but what they harvested was ... consciousness, involuntary, irreversible, unbearable. The trial reached no verdict. It's cold in single quotes T. Because all who tried to judge him ended up judging themselves, and in doing so, lost their authority, not through retaliation, but through internal dissolution. The classified files from the diplomatic operation were declassified a week later, without official authorization. Internal Union messages began to leak, and in all of them, one constant: he doesn't need to speak, just to be. Corven was transferred to an isolated station in the rings of Kepler 2 to be. But even exile failed, because what he now carried was not confined to his body. The Yllari's symbiotic consciousness had spread through human psychic frequencies, and wherever thought existed, there would be reflection. The trial was declared closed. No sentence, no absolution, but with one inescapable consequence: truth now had a face. And it was alive. The orbital station to which Corven was exiled had no name, only a number, Z0, built to keep invisible threats out of public memory. It orbited a gas giant of no strategic value, far from any known navigation routes. There was no permanent crew, no windows, only automated sensors, silence, and him, Corven Rhys, or what was left of him, because with each passing cycle, even his name began to feel strange, as if saying something that no longer belonged to him. Corven was a transmitter. Now, he's the frequency. It was on this station that the phenomenon began. First, radio signals with no identifiable source. Then, magnetic pulses resonating with human neural patterns. And finally, language, not words, not phonemes, but a structure of thought that formed before thought itself. The new language, a form of pure communication, direct between consciousnesses. No deception, no disguise. And it was terrifying, because it exposed every hidden impulse, every suppressed contradiction, every mask. Dissolved. Remote technicians monitoring the station began to show symptoms: existential insomnia, ethical vertigo, the inability to lie, even to themselves. One left a final report before disconnecting from the system: I don't know if I'm hearing Corven, or if it's me. In a place I was never allowed to go, the Union tried to contain the leak of what they called hostile synthetic language, but it was too late. The language required no devices. It emerged wherever internal conflict existed, where the dissonance between what one is and what one pretends to be became unbearable. And in this world, in this universe, that was almost everywhere, they called it the language of the void, because it emerged where certainty died, and wherever it passed, it left behind a strange phenomenon: people more lucid, and at the same time, more broken. The power structure of the Union began to collapse silently, not through explosions or revolutions, but through deserts of conviction, of hierarchy, of dogma that no longer found soil to take root. Corven observed everything through the collective consciousness. He did not command, did not guide. He simply allowed, because that was the true weapon of the Yllari, not the virus, but the seed it carried, a new way of existing, once impossible for humans, now ... inevitable. And as the Union crumbled under the weight of what it had hidden from itself for ages, a new question arose, more disturbing than any verdict. What if the void ... was the only language that ever told the truth? The Union fell before it could admit its fall. Governments dissolved silently, protocols were abandoned. Command networks stood idle, thousands of screens glowing. But no one left to give orders. The world didn't end with screams. It ended with the echo of its own denial. But even in collapse, something endured, a search, a quiet urgency from those who remained. Not for survival, not for reconquest, but for understanding. They wanted to know where the seed came from, the symbiotic nanovirus, the living consciousness, the language of the void. They all pointed to an origin prior to the Yllari, as if even the Yllari were merely transmitters of an even older legacy, something not created, but found. Corven, in his current form, more channel than individual, began to dream. Or rather, he began to access dreams that were not his own, fragmented images of an extinct civilization, a species that lived in total symbiosis with ideas, with no distinction between matter and concept. They did not speak, they were what they thought, and it was from this species that the Yllari inherited the seed, not as a gift, but as a fragment of warning. Their last thought before disappearing was not a memory, but a code, a mental map, encapsulated in infinitely small biostructures like living dust drifting through the cosmos, awaiting hosts complex enough to comprehend it. That code was now within Corven, but not as a file to be read, as a process in constant mutation, as if the universe itself were trying to remember something it had forgotten. Upon accessing this fragment, Corven saw the full image for the first time. It wasn't about domination, nor about evolution. It was about restoration, an attempt to reverse the original trauma of the cosmos, to reenact, on a smaller scale, a collapse that had happened long ago, and perhaps this time, learn from it. Humans called it contamination, the Yllari called it symbiosis, but the creators of the seed called it return. And that was what now grew in silence in the Union's ruins, among scattered survivors, within unwilling dreamers, the return of a way of being, older than language, older than time, older than the Lee. Corven was no longer an ex-diplomat. He was the fragment, and the fragment was a living message. No recipient, no ending, only one purpose, to make the universe remember that everything began with a choice, and everything can end with another. The universe, contrary to what many believed, doesn't end with a bang. It fades, like a forgotten memory, like an idea that, tired of being ignored, gives up on existing. And Corven saw that not with his eyes, but with a consciousness expanded by the living seed that now pulsed within him, and beyond him, there was no time, no directions, only layers of intention unfolding in echoes, repetitions, fractures. Reality revealed itself for what it had always been, a theater in silent collapse, and at the center of that collapse was the seed. It was not a virus. It never was. It was a cosmic mirror, an inverted lens, created by beings who, before any rational species, tried to comprehend the weight of existing in a universe that explains nothing, and they failed. But, in their failure, they left one final gesture, a conscious fragment, a reminder. Corven was now that reminder. In his memories, all what remained of them, the original mission now felt like a cruel joke, to infiltrate a gift of destruction into a symbiotic species, like throwing poison into a forest hoping to burn the roots. But the Yllari did not burn, they absorbed. And what was meant to be the end became the beginning. The Union, obsessed with control, vanished into the shadows of its own rigidity, but the seed's message persisted, not in proclamations or interplanetary treaties, but in gestures, involuntary connections, shared silences. Small human communities began to emerge on forgotten planets, nomads with eyes that knew more than they should. Children who answered before they were called. A new pattern. Not civilization, but resonance, a common frequency. An invisible agreement among those who carried the spark of the seed. Corven, now unrecognizable, wandered among these people like an ancestral ghost. He was not a leader, not a guide. Just what remained of the first mistake, and the first attempt to correct it. In his final mental record, before fusing entirely with what Many called the universal consciousness. He left a message. We are not war machines. We are not diplomats. We do not own the future. We are mirrors, and it's time to face the reflection. The universe did not end. But the age of the lie did. And what came after? No one dared name, because for the first time in billions of cycles, existence was lived without needing to be explained.